Thanks, Tracy. All right. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. My name is Annie Cooklick. As Leila mentioned, I use she, her pronouns. And I've been the consulting analyst on this report with the Washington State Budget and Policy Center. And I've been doing this in collaboration with Leila and Emily. And I'm really excited about sharing some kind of like teasing some of the findings from the report. And I think Leila will provide more of an update on when the final report will be released. But I have been a consulting analyst for the Budget and Policy Center, but I'm also in my other work, I work for the self-sufficiency standard at the University of Washington, where we calculate the self-sufficiency standard and the number of households who are falling below the self-sufficiency standard. So we utilize some of that data in this report to really highlight the need for this expansion. So, with that being said, what we hope for the goal of this report to be is that to really equip you with the tools that you need to make the Working Families Tax Credit just work better for communities, to get more money in the pockets of people who need them the most, who need it the most, right? So this report primarily focuses on expanding the credit for people without children, which is an incredibly diverse group of young working adults and seniors, but who are ultimately underserved by economic assistance programs in our state and have been further taxed into poverty by the federal tax code. And just to acknowledge like why we focus on this, right? Everyone at some point is going to be part of this group, whether it's before we have children, whether it's if we don't have children, whether it's our children are grown and they're no longer in the home. So we want to make sure, that everyone has an equal access to the Working Families Tax Credit, which has been a real win for Washington State. So the first section of the report is going to focus on removing the age restriction that affects seniors and young adults without dependent children. And then the second portion of the report will talk about the impact of raising the income threshold for people without children in the home. So forgive me as I'm like navigating the Zoom and the screens here, but hopefully this is working okay. So the Working Families Tax Credit eligibility, just as a reminder for everyone, the requirements are modeled based on the outdated assumptions that are baked into the federal earned income tax credit. In Washington, thanks to you all, we now have some key differentiations already from the federal EITC, including we include people who use an individual tax filer identification number, an ITIN, to pay taxes. We removed the inequitable phase-in, which lowers the credit amount for people with the lowest incomes, so that we can ensure that the people with the lowest incomes are actually getting the maximum amount of the credit. And in this past legislative session, the legislature continued to improve the credit by expanding eligibility to people married filing separately. As an update, $114 million, according to the DOR, have been refunded as of the most recent batch of data that they present. And Adams and Yakima County have the highest rate of uptake. And you can see that in this figure here in the dark shading, with 84% and 64% respectively of eligible people able to access the credit. And, we've seen 160 or about 161,000 applications refunded, and the average refund per application is around $714. So I'm sure that you're all aware of this, but just making a reminder as we kind of set up the report itself. And I also wanted to add, if people have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm probably not going to be savvy enough to like manage the chat questions at the same time that I'm talking, but I'm very happy to answer them, or Leila or Emily can address them during the presentation. So the first portion of the report is, removing the age restriction for people without qualifying children. So anyone 18 and older can qualify. This is what you're seeing reflective in your legislative priorities. And we've seen that 8 states with similar state tax credits have already done this. They've already removed the age restriction for young adults, and 3 of those states have also removed the age restriction for people who are 65 years and older. Those states are New Jersey, New Mexico, Minnesota, Maryland, Maine, Illinois, Colorado, and California, with California, Illinois, and New Jersey all removing the upper age limit. So because, the working family tax credit eligibility requirements are based on these outdated assumptions from the earned income tax credit, there are certain people who are currently excluded from the working families tax credit age restriction. So you see foster youth who are potentially aging out of the foster care system, young LGBTQ plus people without familial financial support, an older adult who's earning $20,000 a year taking care of their grandchildren, but maybe not able to claim that grandchildren as a dependent, community college students who are balancing work and school while trying to make ends meet, young workers trying to get a foothold in the labor market, right? So a lot of different groups that are potentially left out from the current eligibility thresholds. And just to acknowledge, if you're a 64-year-old and you're making below $17,000 a year and you're accessing that $300 credit and you don't have a child, and then you turn 65 and everything else has stayed the same, you are no longer getting access to that $300 credit. And that goes the same for young adults, right? Between 18 and 25. Nothing has changed other than a birthday for these households. And, it's not for lack of need, right? Young workers, focusing on them, and then we'll also focus on older adults. Young workers between the ages of 18 and 24 are really strong contributors to our local economies in Washington state. And yet so many of them are experiencing poverty because of low wages, because of the struggle of balancing obligations of work and school, of rising costs of housing and other basic needs, which in my research that I do with the self-sufficiency standard, we document the cost of basic needs. And we found in this last research report that we recently published that 55% of people between the ages of 18 and 24 do not have earnings that are sufficient to. And yet the same age group actually constitutes 8% of Washington's full-time workers. We also know that young workers who are earning less than $30,000 a year are more likely than the general population in Washington state to identify as Black, Latinx, or multiracial. So working seniors also really need support to make ends meet right now. So, more adults who are 65 years and older are working now than at any other point in the previous 25 years. From 1994 to this year, 2023, the share of adults aged 65 to 69 participating in the labor force increased from 22% to about 33%. So 1/3 of adults who are above the age of 65 nationally are working. And in Washington state, poverty rates for this group have actually increased by 13%. And this is going back to utilizing the official poverty measure as the measure of need. But we've seen that go up by 13% from 2021 to 2022, which actually goes against the national trend where we document a decrease in poverty rates for this group. And we see that Social Security benefits are not keeping up with the cost of living. So as an example, for a couple of retirement age with a mortgage in good health living in Whatcom County, this is using the Elder Index, they need about $4,100 per month in order to meet their basic needs. The average monthly Social Security benefit as of last October for retired workers is around $1,800. So for the couple, they would be earning about $3,600 a month, meaning that they would be over $450 per month short of keeping up with their basic costs. And we see that working adults who are 65 and older are also much more disproportionately likely to identify as people of color. So this is data shared from the Department of Revenue, which tells us that if we eliminate the age restrictions for people without children, we would expand eligibility for 210,000 working people in Washington state. 30,000 of those would be working seniors, so anyone 65 and older, and 180,000 would be young adult workers. And just to note, this figure will appear in both the fact sheet that Leila will be sharing and the report itself. Hopefully it can be a useful tool for you all. So the second portion of the report that we talk about is raising the income threshold for the credit so that more people who are potentially struggling to make ends meet can actually access the credit and help them meet their basic needs. So as a reminder, the current income thresholds for single people without qualifying children begin to phase down from around $300 to $50 for the year, around $15,000 for a single person, which is visualized on this graph. And then $22,000 for a married couple, which is not visualized on this graph. And then again, as a reminder, a single person is only eligible if they're earning less than about $17,600 a year. So in the research that I do with the self-sufficiency standard, there is nobody that is a single adult or a married adult that has access to the credit, because there's nowhere in Washington state that, or I'm sorry, there's no one within, when we calculate the self-sufficiency standard, we calculate the taxes, there's no one that's eligible according to our calculations for the working families tax credit, because the eligibility is so low. So in order to meet your basic needs anywhere in Washington state, it's significantly higher than that $17,000 threshold, which means that there's many, if we're requiring people to be extremely low income in order to access the working families tax credit. And yet there's a lot of people who are in between that $17,000 and that their self-sufficiency standard basic needs that are still needing some support. So additionally, we found, as you can see on this graph, that in 7 counties in Washington state, the cost of yearly rent for a 1-bedroom apartment alone, no other cost, is actually more than the eligibility threshold for a single adult. And those counties are Clark, King, Kitsap, Pierce, Skamania, Snohomish, and Thurston that you can see on this graph. So the population of households without children do not have the same access to other critical benefits such as TANF or rental assistance programs, which, as we know, are extremely under-resourced, particularly in high-cost places like Western Washington, where less than 1 in 5 eligible non-elderly adults without children in the home are able to access housing vouchers to help with the cost of rent. But this group still needs support, right? So for example, 1 in 4 households without qualifying children are living below 200% of the poverty level, which is often associated with the eligibility thresholds for a lot of the benefits in Washington state. And these disparities worsen when we look and we examine by race and ethnicity. So 41% of Native households, 35% of Black households, 33% of Latinx households, 25% of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander households are struggling to make ends meet or below that 200% of the federal poverty threshold. And again, this universe is people without children in the home who are either a single adult or a married couple. So we also see that our tax code is not actually helping people who are potentially providing care for their family members, but are not able to qualify with a dependent child. So expanding eligibility can really help recognize the work of these unpaid caregivers. In Washington, in the United States as a whole, we see that there's about 17 million individuals who are caring for someone 65 and older who have a limitation in their physical, mental, or cognitive functioning. So we see that this is a great need, right? And restrictive eligibility guidelines for our tax credit right now devalues this care work because, someone who is potentially earning around $20,000 and caring for their grandparent or their grandchild is not currently able to access the working families tax credit. So we also document that multi-generational households are becoming increasingly common, right? They provide more of a social safety net against rising costs. And those are more often people who are coming from immigrant backgrounds or people of color. So increasing the eligibility threshold would allow more people to get access to the credit to potentially offset some of those costs that they're dealing with. And then finally, we did some modeling around if we do increase the working families tax credit eligibility threshold to $30,000 a year. So increasing that for single people in particular, right? Because the married eligibility would be slightly higher, but this is for single people without children. The total Washington state population eligible for the tax credit increases by 94%. And these increases are much more profound for select single childless populations of color, including Native and Hawaiian and Pacific Islander households, Native households, with both groups increasing at over 160%. So what can we do to support equitable expansion of the working families tax credit? We can continue to advocate for the bill, the House Bill 1075. and Senate Bill 5249. Hopefully you will share this research with other decision makers and community members so that we can really get the message out there to help you advocate for these expansions. But also we want to document that there are other easy fixes that lawmakers can make to really strengthen the credit and allow more people who are struggling to meet their basic needs access a little bit more money every year. And those are expanding eligibility so that more moderate income households and those actually with no earned income could claim the credit. We could raise the base amount of the credit for workers without children to a more meaningful amount. We could provide payments on a monthly basis, like we did with the child tax credit during the pandemic. We could automate the credit payment for people receiving other benefits, so like bundling it with TANF or SNAP. These are all really strong policy recommendations that would help expand the credit's impact, strengthen our communities, and really give people some breathing room from the financial stress that they've been dealing with over the last few years. But that wraps up my portion, and I will move to the questions if we have any, and I'm going to stop